Welcome to Consultancy Scrum. What I'm going to talk about today is how we at Four Kitchens have modified Scrum to work in a client-facing environment. I'd like to save questions if possible to the end. I'm going to try and build in about 10 minutes of question time. I am going to cover some of the stuff early on a little quickly because there's some new additions to our process that are kind of new as of the past couple of months. So I don't know if you've seen this, if you were in Portland or if you've been to some other events lately. This is a newly updated version of Consultancy Scrum with some brand new stuff that we've started to do. So very, very quickly about myself. My name is Todd. Hello. I am a digital strategist and partner at Four Kitchens. You can reach me here, todd@fourkitchens.com, or on the Twitters at Todd Ross. Warning, if you follow me, it will mostly be bad puns. So I'm really into Drupal, design, development, and in a previous life I was a writer and editor. So that's about me. Let's talk about why we're here. So here's the problem. Scrum was designed for products and internal teams and stakeholders. Consultancies work on projects, not products, with external teams and stakeholders. So who here knows what I'm talking about when I say Scrum? Who here really kind of doesn't? Okay. My apologies to you in advance. There's going to be a lot of inside baseball about Scrum. But we can always talk later on and I can explain the basics of Scrum and what all that means. Who here uses Scrum on a regular basis? Okay, about a quarter of you. And how many of you would consider yourselves to be a firm, a consultancy, or an agency, meaning not an internal team? And how many people here are part of an internal team? Great, okay. So this does apply to most people in the audience. I'm going to refer to two kinds of Scrum, half-jokingly Scrum Classic trademark, and Consultancy Scrum. And when I talk about Scrum Classic, I'm talking about the Scrum that everybody's used to. If you read the books and you watch the videos about Scrum and who should be on the teams and what subject matter experts mean and who the PO is and all of that, I'm talking about Scrum Classic. But I'm also going to be talking about Consultancy Scrum. So to review, this is what Scrum Classic is about. It's about products. It's internally facing. If you're Google or IBM or you're a startup, then you have a product that you're working on, and your team is usually a series of part-time, full-time employees or contractors whose time you control and are usually within your four walls, either literally or virtually. The stakeholders control all of these resources, so they control the money, the time, the people who are working on it, the scope. It's all within one culture and one organization moving one product forward. And the stakeholders, according to true Scrum form, say that the thing is done when it's done. It's not necessarily done by a certain date. It's done when it's good enough. It's done when it's done. In Consultancy Scrum, we are working on projects, not products. We are hired by a company to build something extra onto their product, or to make a website for them, or to build an intranet for them. So it's not really a product that we're working on. It's also externally facing. That means that we as consultants are having to work outwardly with our clients, the stakeholders, to prioritize the backlog, to determine what their resources are, their amount of money they have, the amount of time they have. So we are having to communicate with people who are outside of our immediate team. So now we have two groups. These two groups, the clients and the vendors, they share control of the resources. The vendors control the people and the amount of time that they're spending on the project. The clients control usually the deadlines and the amount of money they can spend, as well as MVP or the minimum viable product or the stuff that has to get done in order for the thing to be ready and go public or whatever their milestone is. And of course, the biggest differentiator here is in Consultancy Scrum, it's done when we, the client, say it's done. So as a vendor, you're not really done with the project until the client is satisfied. So there are a lot of big differences there. So I want to talk about some of the ways in which we have modified Scrum to work for us. A little bit of background. We got started using Scrum 5.5 years ago when we were working with The Economist magazine on their massive, massive migration and relaunch of economist.com. They did something really forward-thinking and very interesting. They made that entire project Scrum-based. They hired Scrum coaches Scrum consultants, Scrum project managers, Scrum masters. And they not only had all vendors and their internal teams work in Scrum, but they had their management team perform Scrum as well. So there were different teams working on different projects on economist.com. There were, I think at one point, 6 different things: a commenting system, front page system, migration, all of these different things happening in parallel, which would then result in what's called the Scrum of Scrums. So we actually experienced this. So you do a daily Scrum, and then there's the Scrum of all the Scrums, where you'd send one representative, sort of like a pyramid. And then their management team determined what they would be working on this year or this quarter or for the next 3 years using Scrum themselves at a management level, not at a building level. So we experienced Scrum. It was great. Our first experience with Scrum was just absolutely incredible, but they were running all the project management and all of the Scrum themselves, and we learned a lot from them. And as a result of working with them, we adopted it for ourselves, and we haven't used any other kind of methodology since. But in that case, we were augmenting their team, and we were working on their product. So we were joining their team, and it was run much more like Scrum Classic. I was personally working on it as a designer. So I was part of a Scrum team that involved multiple other vendors plus their internal team, and one of their people was the Scrum Master. So it was very much like we had all come together in one organization, internally facing, to move a product forward. Since then, most of our work has been somebody has a problem and we need to solve it, so they hand it off to us and we work with them, and then we deliver the solution. So this brings us to the idea of a product owner. In Scrum Classic, the product owner, or the PO, is the person responsible for the product and for guiding its roadmap, backlog, releases, and iterations. This is the person who has the vision of the entire project in their head and is empowered to make critical decisions about what will and will not be done. What is more important than this? What's more important than this other thing? How do we rank the user stories? Which user stories are we just going to throw away completely? That's the power of the product owner. I took a certified Scrum product owner training course, and the phrase that they kept using, I don't like this phrase, but this is the phrase they use, is that the PO is the single wringable neck of the project. So if something goes wrong, it's the PO's fault. There's the funnel of the stakeholders that goes into the PO, who then has to work with the Scrum Master and the team. So that's the wringable neck. I don't like that phrase, but a lot of people approach the role of product owner as such. So the first thing we did was we renamed it to a project owner, because we're not dealing with products. We are not a products company, we are a services company. So we are working on projects. So this little semantic difference allows us to reframe a lot of the conversations. It's still a PO, so we can still use this really handy acronym, but it's project. We try to assign the role of PO to someone on the client side whenever possible, because they are the ones who are most likely to be fully empowered to make go, no-go decisions about what will or will not be done. The client is always the best person to make that decision. However, sometimes the client cannot be the PO, and in that case, we have to assign it to somebody on our team. Being a PO requires a lot of time. It means attending daily scrums. It means doing regular, what we call backlog grooming. So you go through the backlog to make sure everything is prioritized correctly, that stories are complete, that they are sized, that they have how to demo scripts, that you have a definition of done that you are constantly modifying. Requires a lot of time, plus going to all the demos. So it's a major commitment for anybody. So not all clients can do that. A lot of clients hire services firms like ours and like many of the people here, because they don't want to have to worry about something, right? They have a problem, they need it solved, they're going to hand it off to somebody else and they're going to fix it for them. That's fine. I'm going to talk a lot more about PO and how to train clients as POs in a little bit. So I'm going to skip past this for the time being and talk about the backlog. So in Scrum Classic, the PO is the one writing the stories, prioritizing the backlog, and planning releases and iterations. What's interesting about Scrum Classic is it can be so agile that you don't need to have a full backlog. In Scrum Classic, when you have one company and one team and one vision, you can say, do we have enough stories to do the next sprint? We do? Good, let's just get to it. Because no team wants to sit down for 1 or 2 or 3 days straight, and I mean 8 to 24 hours, of work to write every story, to size every story, to write all the demo scripts. It's a ton of work, and it's incredibly exhausting, and I've done it many times. I don't look forward to it. But in Scrum Classic, you can get to, all right, we got 50 story points. Our last sprint velocity was 40. We got plenty for the next sprint. Let's just go. We're done. Let's do the next sprint. We'll come back and finish our planning in 2 weeks. However, in Consultancy Scrum, you absolutely, positively must have a fully written, fully sized, fully complete backlog from day one, or you will go over budget. Period. Unfortunately, client POs are often intimidated by this backlog, and they're unable to be effective. And that's okay, and they need to be trained. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. The ready size complete backlog is important because knowing your velocity after 1 or 2 sprints, how much work you can get done in a sprint, and comparing that to the amount of story points that remain in the backlog will tell you immediately whether the project is going to end at the right time and on budget. For example, if you have 100 story points in the backlog and you just completed your first sprint and you completed 10 story points, how many more sprints will it take to finish the project? 100 minus 10 divided by 10, 9, right? This is a 10 sprint project. You know after 2 weeks. Now, 20 weeks, right, if you're doing 2-week sprints. If you had planned for a 10-week project, you're in trouble. And you need to have that conversation right away. A lot better to know that now than 10 weeks down the road, because you've been doing this like cyclical backlog grooming thing where you only write enough stories to fill up the next sprint and you don't really know how much work is remaining. You won't know until it's way too late. Also, if you know your burn per sprint, if it costs $10,000 per sprint to run your team, and you know that there are 10 sprints total, it's $100,000. Is that over or under budget? You'll know that after the first sprint, but only if you have a fully sized, complete, and ready backlog. It requires a ton of work, but it's totally worth it. One hint, this is a little off topic, but this is something we found works really well. How many people here, when you estimate projects, estimate by line items and hours? And then how many of you who do this, then when you win the project, write stories and size them according to story points? Why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you writing one thing in the imperial system and then having to convert it to metric? It doesn't make sense. So if you're approaching an estimation on a project, a bid, in terms of line items, I'm going to build this view. There are 4 views and they're half an hour each, therefore 2 hours. And then later on you say, well, that estimate was great, that was fun, throw it away completely. Let's write a series of user stories that don't conceptualize anything in terms of the number of views I'm building. You're conceptualizing things in terms of thin vertical slices, right? I need a blog, and a blog has a view in it of all the blog posts. So you have these 2 completely different systems that you're using to size stuff. If you do your estimations and your bids by writing stories and sizing them as story points, not only will it be more accurate from the beginning, but now when you win the project, guess what you have? A fully sized, complete, and ready backlog. No more 1, 2, 3 days of sitting down and having to write anything out. You're ready to go the next day. Scrum Classic, in the daily Scrum, the PO, Scrum Master, and the team are all supposed to attend. Everybody gives their updates. They ask 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? Do you have any blockers? In Consultancy Scrum, you want to include the client whenever possible. They may or may not be the PO, but you still want to include them whenever possible. However, you have to accept the fact that they may not always attend because they are very busy people and they have hired you to do a job for them. So even though we try very, very, very hard to get our clients to attend all the daily Scrums so they know what's going on, we can give them daily updates, we have to work around the fact that they will not always attend. No client attends 100% of the daily Scrums. So you have to come up with some kind of other workflow. You take notes and you email it to them after the Scrum. Very easy. Have the Scrum Master take notes, email it out right away. There are all kinds of things that you can do to work around this to make sure that they have the experience of daily updates and they understand what's going on and that they are privy to the conversations about blockers and things that are slow or pulling in new stories from the backlog because you finished up your sprint early or whatever it is. So at the end of every sprint, you have a demo. You demo your work. Formal acceptance criteria, right? You show the work, the PO accepts it, and the stakeholders have an opportunity to ask questions about that work. That's typically what happens in Scrum Classic. But in Consultancy Scrum, clients don't necessarily know a lot about the work you're doing. They can't speak to the technical details or the creative details. They know the big picture, but they are going to get lost in a lot of, well, I clicked here and I did this and I did that, and they told me it was done and they told me it worked, so I accept it's done. And when you hear that kind of the voice going up like this, and that's how they accept their stories, that's bad. That means that they don't really understand what they just accepted. And another sprint or two, or whenever the milestone is, comes along, they're going to realize, oh, all of that time I was accepting work and calling it done, and I didn't actually know what it was doing. I didn't know that I was really accepting work. I'm sorry. This isn't what I wanted. So you pre-demo. After you finish every story, you call them up or you send them an email. If you're using things like feature branching on your code, meaning for every story you have a different branch of code, a different environment that they can go to and test it, you give them a link to that, you tell them how to test it themselves. Hey, do these things, see if it works. Is this what you want? Or you get them on the phone and you screen share and you show it to them. It does require more time, but if you pre-demo every story, there are no more surprises by the time the sprint demo arrives. And the sprint demo then becomes a formal acceptance procedure of, I remember that, I liked it, I saw it, that makes sense, yes, I am truly confident that I can accept that story as done. In the case where the PO isn't necessarily on the client side, you still want to have clients attend the demos. I'm going to refer to them as stakeholders here. And both the client stakeholder and your own PO should have the ability to accept or reject stories, which is a modification of Scrum. In Scrum Classic, only the PO can accept or reject stories, and all the stakeholders can do is listen and ask questions. But in Consultancy Scrum, the client is your client. So your client should have the power to accept or reject stories, working alongside the PO, whether the PO is also themselves or somebody on your team. Scrum has this notion of pick two, budget, timeline, features, or functionality, right? You can't have all three. One of them has to give. If budget and timeline are the two most important things to you, then you're going to have to negotiate on features. That's the thing that you flex. If features and budget are the most important thing, you need to flex on timeline. You need to work faster or work slower or whatever. And in Scrum Classic, the release backlog is very carefully fine-tuned to maximize the most important two that were picked. In Consultancy Scrum, budget is always one of the two, so ask them to pick one of the two remaining. No matter what they say, if they say, it's okay if we go over budget, I really want to see this stuff done, I just need to see it done by a certain date. They mean well, they may even believe it at that time, but no, budget really is the thing. You can't flex on budget. So you ask them, what are we going to flex on, timeline or functionality? Velocity, how quickly you're moving through your stories. In Scrum Classic, a team should ideally remain the same size throughout the duration of the project or release. This is really easy when you're an internal team. When you're a Google or IBM or Microsoft or Apple or whoever, you can have a team. This is the iPod team. This is the Microsoft Surface team. And they are going to work on this thing until it's done, all of them together. When you're a consultancy, however, your staffing is always fluid and variable. You're going to need design people on a project for the first half, and then they have to move on to another project. That's how this is. You can't have a full team of 5 or 6 people, half of whom might not really be doing anything at any given time because they're desperately needed on another project. So you have to accept the fact that staffing is going to be fluid and variable. And the velocity of each sprint has to be modified according to how many people enter or leave the project. So sprint 1, you get 10 story points done and you have 2 people on the team, and now you add a third, you want to shoot for something more than 10. Or if you had 3 and you drop down to 2, don't expect 2 people to now suddenly be able to do the work of 3 people. So Scrum likes to carry forward the velocity and say, we did 30 in the last sprint, so now we do 40. All right, fast forward 2 weeks, we did 45, so now we're going to do 45 for the next sprint. But if you lose somebody, you can't maintain that velocity. Makes sense, right? So understanding that staffing is fluid and variable, you must absolutely, though, retain a core team for consistency. No client wants to work with you if every 2 to 4 weeks it's a totally new group of people. So if you have a Scrum team of 4 or 5 people, have 2 of those people stay on the project for the duration no matter what. It's going to help maintain velocity as people shift in and out according to their skill sets. It's a better client experience, and it's going to ensure institutional memory. So somebody who was on the project 6 months ago remembers why that thing happened 6 months ago. What was the deal with that story? How come we did it that way? That person will know. In Scrum Classic, you have this notion of timeboxing, and timeboxing is there to investigate features. So one of the things that's sort of an odd fit in Scrum in general is, well, I need to do something, I need to make a blog, but I don't know what CMS I want to choose. And which CMS I choose is going to drastically affect the amount of work necessary. So if I decide I'm just going to subscribe to Tumblr, well, then there's really no work to be done, right? You upload your avatar and you're done. But if I want to build a blog in Drupal, there are lots of things you want to consider, and there's a lot of work you need to do. In Scrum Classic, they say, we're going to give you some amount of time, 2 hours, to research this. And that's it. So do your 2 hours of research, come to a conclusion, then we're going to write a user story about making a blog based on your recommendation. We're going to go Tumblr, WordPress, Drupal, whatever. In Consultancy Scrum, timeboxing is essential to every user story, not just researching, to make sure that a feature is actually that a feature is as only complex as it needs to be. People, especially in consultancies, teams who work in consultancies, strive to make things incredible all the time. So if you allow them to spend however amount of time they need to spend on something, they're going to make it really great. But maybe it didn't need to be 150% great. Maybe it just needed to be 100% great. A lot of people refer to this as things like gold plating, right? You've taken a story and you made it really good, or I want to really fine-tune the theme and put in all these great flourishes and these things that make it really fantastic. But you still need to get through a certain number of stories by the end of the sprint, right? You can always come back and iterate and improve the design, but there's certain goals you need to hit at the end of those 2 weeks. It's really easy to get lost in a problem and make it really, really great. So we try to time box absolutely everything. We have rough rules of thumbs that say a 1-point story really shouldn't take you more than, I don't know, an hour. And if it's a 20-point story, you know, if we've heard that you've been working on this for 5 days and you're still not done, there might be a problem. It might be that you're working too hard on it, or that there is some kind of problem that needs to be surfaced, like the technology isn't the right technology, or there's some other kind of blocker in the way, or the client isn't getting back to them or something. So time boxing is really essential to make sure that we're maintaining velocity and momentum. In Scrum Classic, there are no clients, there are only stakeholders. Stakeholders are the people who have some vested interest in the success of the project, but they have delegated the success of the project to the PO. And the PO, again, is that wringable neck. But in Consultancy Scrum, you are working with clients every day, not just stakeholders. Come back. So you have to meet their emotional needs. You need to have somebody outside of the team, somebody who's not the PO, who's the one who's probably going to give them bad news about what they can and can't do with their budget. You need to have somebody else who is there to talk to, or to reach out to them every couple of sprints and just ask, hey, what's going on? How do you feel? How's the team working for you? That's really, really important. In Scrum Classic, you have practices like continuous integration, pair programming, also called extreme programming or XP, peer reviews, other lean practices. In Consultancy Scrum, that doesn't change. You absolutely want to do that. In fact, it makes it even better. In Scrum Classic, contracts and scopes of work are often not even a thing, because you have an internal team and you say, I want to put this internal team on this project for a year, and we have some kind of a deadline set by marketing because they need to get their materials put together, and then we're going to launch this new laptop or whatever it is. But in Consultancy Scrum, contracts and scopes of work have to exist because you have to have a legal relationship and you have to have some understanding of what it is you are going to do and what you are not going to do. So your scope of work or your contract, or both, whichever you use, have to allow for changes in the plan, in the timing, in the functionality, all that stuff. So our contract, our MSA, on the very first page has a section called Agile Means. And Agile Means defines the way we will communicate and the way we will issue change orders is through Agile Means. And these means include email, voicemail, phone calls, chats, somebody saying in an issue queue, yeah, let's not do this, forget about it, let's take it out of the backlog. So we don't do change orders. We use Agile Means instead, and that's written into our contract. So we allow things to constantly change. You also have to be appropriately vague. Scrum exists because change exists. Scrum exists because people had to account for change in a more agile and efficient way. So your contract has to allow for Scrum. That means making deliverables as vague as they need to be to allow for the inevitable change in what will actually happen 3 or 6 or 9 months down the road. It is absolutely possible to be inappropriately vague, too vague, but you have to strike a nice balance. Additionally, it's always a good idea to document these agreed to changes. So even though you are exercising Agile Means and you're working in issue queues and via email and through phone calls and chats or whatever, make a note of it. Have a document, a Google Doc or something for the project where you say, hey, on this date, this person said we're going to throw this story out. Just make a note of it. Because when you're in the heat of developing a site and there are lots of deadlines and lots of moving parts, it's very easy for people to lose track of decisions they've made, especially the client, because they're busy. They're busy doing their job and working with you. So document all of that stuff. When it happened, what the rationale was, so you have a record. Okay, so back to all the PO stuff. So who should be the PO, the client or the consultant? Bottom line, the PO should be empowered to decide what gets built. More important than whether it's somebody on the client side or somebody on your team, this is it. This defines the PO. The client, for example, might be less interested in the profitability of features and long-term roadmap stuff. They often think of these projects as something that's been outsourced to you to solve for them. In those cases, you need to train them on how to be an integrated, invested owner of the project. So here are the things you need to teach them. You need to teach them what stories are, how to write them, how to prioritize them. So a story is, as a type of person, I need to perform an action so that business value is demonstrated. And really allow them to internalize what that means. That a user story is saying, you're dealing with people, people have to do things, and that thing has to represent business value to you, the client. You have to make sure that they know what to look for when accepting stories. You need to make sure that they are critical reviewers, and you have to make sure they understand why acceptance is so important. When you accept a user story at the end of a demo, that means it's done, and we're not going to talk about it ever again, unless you want to change something in the future, in which case we write a user story and put it in the backlog. You cannot reopen a user story. There are no revolving door user stories. You also then, because this gets confusing, you have to very carefully explain how something can really be done when it's only a part of something else. So if you have a user story that says, as a reader, I want to visit the blog so that I know what your company is doing. Well, a lot of people will think a blog has the capability to log in and post comments, right? That might not be part of the user story. You have to be very clear in your description of the user story that this means a blog is visible, your staff can write blog posts, and people can see them. But it does not include commenting. There's a different user story for commenting because that requires adding in an authentication system or maybe integrating with Facebook or all kinds of other dependencies and things that are also queued up in the backlog. So you need to make sure that they understand that by saying this blog part is done, they're not saying that the commenting is done. That's a different user story. And finally, they really need to be taught how to include the right stakeholders at the right times. Because a lot of clients have lots of stakeholders. They'll have a marketing department, they'll have the IT department, they'll have the site editors, lots of different people. So you need to work with them very closely to figure out when each of these people need to be brought into the conversation and shown the work that you are doing to make sure that it meets their needs. So let's say the client is not the PO. Let's say one of you is the PO on a project. The client still needs to have an intimate understanding of all of the requirements, drivers, and goals of the project, or they're not going to be a good stakeholder. If they don't understand what the project is about, how can they comment on it? They still need to be involved in critical decisions. So if you as the PO say, there's just no way we're going to be able to get to a certain user story, can't build the blog, not enough left in the budget, it was too low on the priority list, the MVP line is above that. They still need to be involved in the decision to not do that, and they have to understand why. Otherwise, it's a surprise at the end of the project when it launches, and they say, hey, I thought we were getting a blog as well. I love this e-commerce site, but where's our blog? The client should still attend the demos and accept the stories, and most importantly, test them immediately. So either you pre-demo it prior to the demo, or they test them that day or the next. This is a lot easier to do if you have a DevOps process in place that allows you to create feature branches for each story, because then you can say, to view the blog story, go to this URL. To view the commenting story, go to this other URL. The client still needs to be available for frequent communication. They can't just drop off the face of the planet. They still need to review the backlog, ideally weekly, to ensure that the stories are still properly prioritized. And this is something that gets forgotten about a lot. Just like everybody who has a to-do list or an email inbox where you're only paying attention to what you see on the first screen, keep an eye on the stories at the bottom to make sure that you haven't forgotten about them. Because if you have a list of 200 stories, it's very easy to feel really comfortable about the first 50, the middle 100, I don't know, and then the bottom 50, you wrote them once and that was it, right? This happens all the time. Okay, so if you're a consultant PO, this is out of experience, so this isn't just a bunch of rules I'm making up. We've tried all of these. The consultant PO should never serve a dual role as a designer or developer. If you're a maker on the project, you cannot be an effective PO. It requires two very different skill sets. Now, you might be the kind of person who could do both really well, but you can't do them at the same time very well. So in one project you might be PO, and on another completely different project you might be a great designer. We've done that, and that works really well. But you can't be the PO and the designer on one single project. You can't be making and managing simultaneously. Now the Scrum Master can sometimes be the PO, and this is for people who are into, like, according to Hoyle, original rules of Scrum, this is one of the biggest things that they freak out about. The Scrum Master in our experience can actually be the PO. But allowing that dual Scrum Master and PO role really depends on the personality of that person, the team, the project, and the client. In some cases it works, and in some cases it doesn't. And the reason why there's a bit of tension there, the reason why Scrum Classic hates this idea of the Scrum Master also being the PO, is because the PO is supposed to be the one who argues with the Scrum Master about what should and should not be done. The Scrum Master sticks up for the team, and then the PO says, yeah, but I really want it. The Scrum Master says, yeah, but we can't really do it. If that's the same person, they are probably going to fall on one side of that balance or the other all of the time, right? That's a really difficult, you have to fight with yourself constantly, which is really difficult. So I mentioned earlier something about account manager, just to illustrate very quickly how we structure these things. So blue means on the client side, green means on our side. There's the client, and the client interacts through two different people. primarily, the product owner and the account manager. I mentioned the importance of the account manager. Somebody who is separate from the project, who is maintaining the client relationship, addressing the emotional needs of the client. Also, a safe third party to go to if they have problems with the PO or the team and don't want to talk to them directly. Now, the product owner, again, sometimes they're on the client side, sometimes they're on our side. That's why we have this little gradient effect happening here. This is kind of the workflow, more or less. Okay, new stuff. I'm going to expound on this for about 5 minutes, and then we can take some questions. We've been thinking a lot lately about how Scrum doesn't work. So we've been doing it for 5-6 years. We've done all these modifications. It's a lot better now. But there are parts of Scrum that just simply do not seem to work. Scrum is great at building. When you have a list of things you need to do and a team of designers and developers and thin vertical slices and you want to hammer out a bunch of work and you know what you're doing, it's great. It's the only thing that makes everybody feel really good. But when you're early on in the project and you're doing design and planning, or if you're later in the project and you're doing support and maintenance, Scrum really doesn't feel right. So design and planning, why does it not really work there? Designers who are doing things like information architecture, UX design, site mapping, the planning, the discovery stuff, setting goals, outlining technical requirements, all the things you need to do to understand the project and where we're going to go, it just doesn't work there because you can't write user stories for it. Technically speaking, in Scrum, a story must result in potentially shippable code. So first of all, you're not writing any code up here, right? Design and planning, there's no code happening. There are deliverables, there are wireframes, there are clickable prototypes, there are content maps and editorial calendars and all the things you do with content strategy, but it's not shippable. It's not usable. It's not something that the user could potentially derive value from because they're plans. But you have to have these plans before you can build. And we tried for years to say, all right, we've got this big website and it's got 30 different huge things that we got to do. We're going to start with, I hate to keep using the blog. Okay, we've got nothing. Where do we start from? Let's talk about content. Let's talk about content types. We're going to talk about the fields. We're going to say we need to do a theme. All of these things that have to be done before we can even start clicking around in Drupal and building things, right? That's technically a thin vertical slice because you start with nothing and you end with a fully functional bit of stuff, the blog. Here you go. Here's your blog. None of that can fit into a sprint. Plus, a lot of designers I've talked to, not just at our own organization, but at many other organizations, they describe using Scrum in design as looking through a cardboard tube. So you're considering the design of a huge platform, but you need to do just the shopping cart. And then next week you're going to be doing, all right, user profiles. And you do that about 100 times. What does it look like at the end? Do you really have the complete picture? Do you ever really have the opportunity as your designs and your user interaction patterns and everything, as they evolve through the course of the project, do you ever really have the time to say, stop, I need to go back to that thing I did on day one and buff it up a little bit because we came up with some really good ideas in the last 6 months that need to be rolled back in terms of design to all of this other stuff that we've done. No, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because it has to be written as a user story in a backlog that's already too full, and it trickles down to the bottom, and then it's forgotten about. So, design and planning, a lot of people who do Scrum have referred to the hidden waterfall of design for a long time. We found that design is just better when you spend time doing it. Slowly, deliberately, with meditation and discussion and reviews. then you have a coherent design, a blueprint. You have all of the raw materials now that you need to build. So then you build, and everybody does Scrum, and they're happy. And the development team loves it, because Scrum was built by engineers for engineers. Now you've launched the site. And you've got a backlog of bugs. And what do you do with bugs in Scrum? You do them first. And as quickly as you can. But you're still doing releases every sprint. So you launch a site, and you're still doing Scrum. You fix a bug that's in the backlog on Monday. When does it get rolled out? 2 weeks later. Clients don't like that. That's not good enough. So what do? You do a code release right then. And then you do the next code release. And the next one. You're not doing Scrum anymore. And that's okay. Do something else. Do something that allows you to map the workflow of something, that allows you to manage a backlog. So a lot of people say, and I was ignorant of this myself too, that Kanban is like Scrum without the sprints. Not true. Kanban is a visualization technique that allows you to move stuff, bugs or stories or whatever, from to-do to in progress to QA to whatever your next step is, to whatever your next step is, to deployment. So if you move away from the sprint structure, at that point, support and maintenance, you can deliver value quickly to your clients, which is the point of Scrum, to deliver value quickly and consistently, without having to do demos and planning and all of these things that cause overhead. Because when you're in bug fix mode, the client doesn't want to hear that, like, yeah, we just spent the past 4 hours in planning.
Yes.
The project is done and there are problems. I want you to fix the problems, right? Okay, that's the new stuff. I would love to hear your thoughts and questions about any of this. Yes, sir.
Just thinking on top of it, so you're trying to combine some concepts of PMI, with Six Sigma, and Scrum?
The question is, are we trying to combine concepts within PMI, Six Sigma, and Scrum? I know nothing about PMI or Six Sigma, so I'll have to take your word for it. I don't mean that flippantly, I mean that honestly. But actually, follow up, what are some of the things that you feel we're doing that are part of those other two?
Well, Kanban, Six Sigma concept, lean manufacturing, very what you just talked about. PMI is all about planning up front to basically define, similar to waterfall, to define everything you need so you can allow designers to do what they need to do. And it's complex, very detail oriented,
Mm-hmm.
but you need to get down into the weeds to flesh out all the problems in the design phase. And there's a whole background.
Okay. So for the purposes of the recording, some of the things that were similar were the idea of lots of planning up front and using Kanban and stuff like that. One clarification I would make, though, is I would not want to engage in heavy-duty, super detailed planning up front no matter what, even in the design and planning phase. The design and planning phase, I'm pointing at a thing that isn't there anymore. Design and planning phase is more about understanding the cohesive vision of everything. Not, we're going to build a blog and it will be this content type and have these fields and it will be exported as a feature and then it will be managed this way, and not like that. There should still be technical architects, of course, involved in this, but it's intended to be higher level so that at the end of a planning phase you can say, you know what? I understand everything that's happening here and I feel good about it and I feel like it's coherent and cohesive, and that we now have enough information to go to the people who are going to build it, the themers and the back-end people and the engineers and everybody, who then have enough information to actually strip off a thin vertical slice and deliver it. To do just enough planning and just enough design to do real thin vertical slices. Another thing I should add about why we're thinking about doing more of this design and planning in a deliberate way up front is we would do things like Sprint 0, and Sprint 0 was our planning sprint. And then we'd have like Sprint 1, and that was our design sprint, or whatever. But those were frustrating because the delivery, when we did the demo, The demo is supposed to, that's the big show, right? The demo is, wow, look at all of the stuff we did in the last 2 weeks. Isn't it impressive? Aren't we a great company? Aren't you so happy? But if you're doing a sprint zero, it's like, ta-da, we wrote the backlog. Here's your sitemap. You know, it's like a big wet fish is thrown on the table, and everybody just kind of stares at it. And then, you know, then after like sprint 2 or 3, that's when the client's like, oh, now I get it, and it's great, and I see the vision coming to life. So when you start sprinting, it should be bringing the vision to life. Also, we found that a lot of our clients felt very rushed when we were putting design into sprints, because they felt like they wanted to sit and think about this stuff, because these were big ideas, and they were soft ideas too. It was like aesthetics and messaging, and that's not something you can say, all right, it's Monday, next Friday, we're going to have all of this messaging stuff done. Well, it's good to time box things, to give yourself an incentive, to give yourself a deadline, but that's good for us as consultants, but it's not good for clients who want to sit down and think and talk and do research and run it by some people and all of that stuff. So you have to give them that time to breathe and think and meditate. Yes, ma'am?
So I just recently started with my projects making the conscious switch between Scrum to a Kanban system right at the UAT point, so that I can start doing it in really rapid cycles. It is a little bit of a disconnect for the team. It takes a good week to get settled. Found that getting easier the more you guys do it. Do you do that routinely now?
So the question is, you're finding a disconnect between the transition from the design and planning phase to the build phase.
Build to maintenance.
Oh, build to maintenance. So have we found it, and what do we do? We found the easiest way to do it is the sprint prior to launch. We have a hardening sprint. So code freeze. No new functionality gets added to the site. It is purely like last final super careful round of QA and or getting to the technical debt that's just kind of been floating in the background, and you want to scoop it all up and fix it. There's this this one template over here that was always kind of messy, and I want to spend a couple hours fixing it up. That gets people in more of a mindset of, I want to do a thing and finish it, and another thing and finish it, another thing and finish it, and fix this and fix that. That helps ease that transition, as well as provide a lot of value to fine-tuning and putting that like final coat of paint on the project before it's launched. And it also, I mean, it's really necessary, especially with the big projects. You need to have a hardening sprint at least to do performance testing. So have all the code in, performance test it, front and back end, and then you launch at the end of that sprint. Yes, sir?
It seemed to me that Scrum kind of depends a lot on fairly fluid communication with the teams working. Do you have much experience with geographically dispersed or even time zone dispersed teams? And can you talk about that a little bit? About
Sure.
Things that you discovered or did?
Absolutely. The question is, Scrum requires a lot of communication between members of the team. Do we have experience handling geographically dispersed teams? Yes, we do. We actually recently switched from a totally in-person model to a hybrid model where we have people working remotely, and we plan to expand that and hopefully be about 50-50 at some point. Communication is a lot easier when you have the hallway conversations and all of that stuff, absolutely. It's the first thing I would advise is, because this speaks to a larger, like, how do you manage a company thing, not just a project. If you have anybody in your organization or anybody on a team who is geographically dispersed, you have to treat it as if everybody were. So none of your meetings should be exclusively in person. They should be done through Google Hangouts or GoToMeeting or video chat or something, or record them and make them available to other people to see. Or do everything through issue queues. You need to assume that unless you do something in a third place, that somebody is going to be left off the list, and somebody is going to fall behind, and they're going to, not only will they not have the information they need, but they're going to resent it. Time zone stuff can be pretty tricky. We've been fortunate in that we haven't had to deal with a lot of huge time zone differences. With our clients, sure. And that's, if the client's in Europe and we're over here, we can figure that out. But if we have 2 members of our team in Europe and the other 6 are here, that can be pretty difficult. I don't have a clear answer for that yet. That's something we're actively working through. And I'd love to hear, unfortunately we're out of time right now, but I would love to hear from other people to continue this conversation to see what other people have done in those cases. So we are out of time. Thank you so much for all these great questions. If you would like to reach out to me, and please, please, please do, this is part of a whole movement that I want to spread around and get other people involved in, Consultancy Scrum. My contact information is on my card up here. I also have some Drupal stickers and DrupalCon Austin stickers, which are in limited supply, so grab them while you can. Thank you so much for your time.